We have all been there before. We've all forgotten the password to our Linux system, whether that is running on hardware or just a VM like this one. You try password, password1, password but the A is an @ sign, and none of them seem to work. Now, obviously, if you have a second account that has sudo privileges, you can go and use that account to go and reset the password of a different account, but let's say you don't. Let's say you have a single account or you've forgotten the password to all of your accounts and can no longer log in altogether. You're stuck at this prompt and you have no idea what to do. Luckily, resetting a password on Linux actually isn't that difficult, but it might be different on some systems. So we're going to go through a couple of really easy approaches, and this should address basically all systems. There is two caveats though. If you use disk encryption, I really cannot help you because that password is there to go and decrypt the disk, and if there was some way to get around that by like resetting that password, you wouldn't actually have disk encryption. Also, you will need to have physical access to the hardware because we'll need to access the bootloader or load up an ISO. If you're trying to reset the password on something like a VPS, there's probably going to be something in your VPS provider's dashboard to go and reset the password without having to go and fiddle around with stuff like we're doing. The first thing we're going to be doing is modifying our kernel parameters to drop us into a root shell without going through the login prompt. Now, I'm going to be showing this on both Grub and systemd boot. Now, I know other bootloaders do exist, but this is going to cover the vast majority of people on Linux. And the process of what you need to change is exactly the same. It's just different ways of opening up the kernel parameters. So if you're using something different, look up how to open kernel parameters on that bootloader. Now, we're going to start off by looking at Grub. Ignore the fact that I'm using Gentoo. This is going to be exactly the same regardless of what distro you are using. So if you go and hover over the distro you want to go and modify, in this case being Gentoo, and then press the E key, this is going to open up a minimal version of Emacs. So if we go and use the arrow keys to go and navigate down to the section that we go and load Linux in, that is this line right here marked with Linux, what we can go and do is change the init system we're using from, in my case, OpenRC, and actually force this to use a shell instead. And when you go and force it to be a shell, it's going to drop you straight into the shell without going through all of that login nonsense. So in the case of Gentoo, this is going to be set to RO. Make sure this is set to RW to be read-write. Otherwise, you have to go and mount the file system to actually give you that write access, and we do need that to modify the password file. So if we go and append init equals /bin / a shell that you know you have installed, most systems have bash, then we'll be good. If we then go and append init equals, and then the path to a shell we know we have installed on our system, this can be dash, bash, zsh, fish. It literally does not matter what shell you use as long as we can get shell access. I know that bash is installed on my system, and bash is going to be installed on most Linux systems out there, so I'm going to include /bin /bash, and then if we go and press Control X or F10, that is going to go and try to boot into the system. And assuming I didn't make a spelling mistake, that is going to boot us into that, and there we go. Now we have a shell. Don't worry about having to go and reset that value. That is only being set for this one boot of the system, and then after that, it's going to go back to what it originally was. Now feel free to jump ahead to actually resetting the password. Everything is set up for Grub now. When it comes to systemd boot, there's not going to be much of a prompt of what you can actually do. Make sure you go and press something like the up or the down key, because otherwise systemd boot is going to run out the timer and then automatically select what you're currently highlighting. So go and select the distro you want to modify. So in my case, that's going to be Arch Linux, but this is going to be exactly the same regardless of what distro you're using. Once you're hovering over that, go and press the E key, and this will bring up the kernel parameters. Basically, how systemd boot is telling the kernel to actually launch. And at the end of this line, if we go and press the right arrow key, that's going to go and move us over that. What we need to do is go and append init equals, and then a shell that we know we have installed on our system. So that could be, you know, bash, it could be ZSH, it could be dash, it could be fish. It literally doesn't matter what shell you're using, any shell is going to do. I am going to use bash just because I know I have bash installed on my system, and most Linux systems are going to have that, so that's going to be fine. Now, one other thing is if that RW is not set to RW, make sure that is set. Otherwise, you have to go and remount the file system to make sure you have write access, and write access is very important when we are modifying the password file. If you boot your system and you don't see this window, it just jumps directly to Linux, it's very likely the system deboot timer has been disabled. So in that case, when you boot your system, mash the spacebar and it should go and open up this window like you would do if you're trying to open up your BIOS or UEFI with one of the function keys. And if you press E and the kernel parameters don't exist, it's very likely that parameter editing has been disabled inside of your system deboot config, in which case, go and jump to the next section. For us though, I'm going to go and press enter, and that is going to go and boot up the system, and once that is booted, as we can see, it skips completely past the login and drops us straight into a root shell. Now, from this point, feel free to skip ahead to the resetting your password section, and I'm going to start on live CD. This time what we're going to be doing is booting into the system with a distro installer, not to go and reinstall a distro. Instead, what we're going to be doing is using it to do system maintenance to access the hard drives and go and actually change the password like that. So this isn't going to be in any danger of like wiping the system or anything like that, so you're going to be fine. Now, technically, any distro can be used to do this. You could use Ubuntu, Gentoo, Mint, literally anything you want. I am going to be using Arch Linux because I find Arch Linux to be a very convenient way to do this, but that doesn't mean this only works on Arch-based distros. I can take Arch and then go and modify the password on Gentoo or Ubuntu. It's going to work the exact same way. First thing we need to do is go and get ourselves an Arch Linux ISO. This can be done from the Arch Linux website. The recommended way to go and download it is through a torrent, so you can go and seed it and do all of that nice stuff. But if you want to go and use the HTTP download and just download the file directly, that can be done as well. And once you've gone and downloaded this, you'll need to go and make a USB thumb drive installer like you would do with anything you want to install. So if you're doing it from Windows, you could use something like Rufus. If you're using Linux, you can use cat, cp, ddt, anything like that. I'll leave some links in the description down below on how to make a bootable thumb drive. Once you've done that, you need to go and plug in the thumb drive and restart your system. Go into your BIOS or UEFI, depending on what you're using, usually done by pressing one of the function keys. Refer to your motherboard's documentation for this, and then tell your system to boot off of the thumb drive rather than booting off of your regular hard drive. The way this is done very much depends on the motherboard you're on. Sometimes it's just changing the boot order. Sometimes you have to go and like enable USB boot and then put the USB at the top. Once again, refer to your motherboard's documentation on how to do this. If you're instead using a VM like I am, what you need to do is go into your VM settings. Now, I am using VirtualBox, so what I do here might be a bit different if you're using something like QEMU, in which case go and check the documentation for that specific software. Make sure you have your optical boot above your hard drive boot or hard disk boot in this case, and then go into your storage and make sure you attach the ISO, and from here you are good to go and boot into the system. Now, there's going to be a couple of different options you can choose from when you boot into the Arch ISO. The only ones we need to care about are this first one and the second one. So the second option here is going to have some accessibility options enabled, which might help for some users who actually need them, such as having screen reader support and things like that. In my case, I'm going to go with the first option though, and from here, it's going to boot up the ISO, but it's not actually going to go and mount any of our hard drives. We're going to have to go and do that ourselves. The first thing I would recommend doing is running lsblk. This will go and tell you what partitions actually exist on your system. So I know that my system is installed on SDA, and I have an SDA1, SDA2, and SDA3. What we need to do is mount the root partition. So if you don't know which one your root partition is, generally if you use like Ubuntu or something like that, it's going to be your biggest partition. The smallest one is going to be your bootloader. Then the second biggest usually is going to be your swap. I cannot confirm how it's going to be set up on your system. It's going to depend on how you actually installed Linux. Once you've worked it out, run the mount command, pass into that the location of that partition. So that is going to be /dev and then / whatever your partition is. In my case, that is SDA3, and then where you want to mount it to. Now, it doesn't really matter for what we're doing, but the standard location to mount stuff is to the /mnt point. Now the root partition has been mounted to our system, and we can go and access all of that data. You can confirm that by doing an ls on /mnt, and you'll see that all of the stuff in your root directory is now going to be there. The problem we have now is currently the root for our system is set inside of the ISO, not inside of that /mnt point, so we need to go and change that. On Arch Linux, we use arch-chroot. This just makes it so all of the extra stuff we need to set up for chroot to actually work is going to be set up. Then we need to pass in where we actually mounted the root partition to actually be. That was /mnt, and once you've done that, now you are ready to set the password. Regardless of how we got here, resetting the password is done in the exact same way with the passwd command. So if you want to go and reset the root account password, you don't need to include a value, but you can go and include its name, which is obviously root. If you want to go and reset the password for a user account, go and include the name for that account. Let's say in my case, it would be something like Brodie. However, I'm just going to reset the root account password, so I'm going to run it like this, and Gentoo has some extra restrictions, so if you don't see exactly this, that is going to be fine. Once you've gone and set the password, assuming you haven't made any mistakes in the setup process, you should be able to reboot your system and log in with that new password. As we can see it working in my case here. If you are doing this on hardware with the live CD approach, make sure you go and unplug that thumb drive, otherwise it's going to probably drop you straight back into the installer. Now there is a third approach we could have taken. That is by using the systemd debug shell, which will work on every systemd distro. I don't particularly like this approach though, because it requires some extra setup for not really any extra value, and even though a lot of Linux does use systemd, not all of it does. So I don't really want to leave out those ones that don't, just for the sake of including something that I don't think you should use anyway. Now hopefully you learned something from this video, and if you just watched it for the fun of it, you hadn't actually forgotten a password, when you do forget a password, hopefully you remember, oh yeah, Brodie did that video a while ago, didn't he? I'm not actually screwed. And you can just go about your day. More people need to know about doing things like setting a shell to be your init system, because there's a lot of things you can go and fix that you would otherwise have to go and do some like live CD fiddling around to get working. That's going to be it for me, and if you like this video and you want to support the channel and become one of these amazing people over here, please check out my Patreon, subscribe, certainly Pay, linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays, where I live stream twice a week, upload about 5 or so YouTube shorts, and this channel is also available over on Odyssey. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.